I suppose. After being bewildered, they don't have any recourse other than refraining from continuing their nefarious task. If the predators don't eat our glowing coat of awareness for a while, he went on, it'll keep growing. Simplifying this matter to the extreme, I can say that sorcerers, by means of their discipline, push the predators away long enough to allow their glowing coat of awareness to grow beyond the level of their toes. Once it goes beyond the level of the toes, it grows back to its natural size. The sorcerers of ancient Mexico used to say that the glowing coat of awareness is like a tree. If it is not pruned, it grows to its natural size and volume. As awareness reaches levels higher than the toes, tremendous maneuvers of perception become a matter of course. The grand trick of those sorcerers of ancient times, Don Juan continued, was to burden the flyer's mind with discipline. They found out that if they taxed the flyer's mind with inner silence, the foreign installation would flee, giving to any one of the practitioners involved in this maneuver the total certainty of the mind's foreign origin. The foreign installation comes back, I assure you, but not as strong, and a process begins in which the fleeing of the flyer's mind becomes routine until one day it flees permanently. A sad day indeed. That's the day when you have to rely on your own devices, which are nearly zero. There's no one to tell you what to do. There's no mind of foreign origin to dictate the imbecilities you're accustomed to. My teacher, the Nagual Julian, used to warn all his disciples, Don Juan continued, that this was the toughest day in a sorcerer's life, for the real mind that belongs to us, the sum total of our experience, after a lifetime of domination has been rendered shy, insecure, and shifty. Personally, I would say that the real battle of sorcerers begins at that moment. The rest is merely preparation. I became genuinely agitated. I wanted to know more, and yet a strange feeling in me clamored for me to stop. It alluded to dark results and punishment, something like the wrath of God descending on me for tampering with something veiled by God himself. I made a supreme effort to allow my curiosity to win. What do you mean, I heard myself say, by taxing the flyer's mind? Discipline taxes the foreign mind to no end, he replied. So through their discipline, sorcerers vanquish the foreign installation. I was overwhelmed by his statements. I believed that Don Juan was either certifiably insane or that he was telling me something so awesome that it froze everything in me. I noticed, however, how quickly I rallied my energy to deny everything he'd said. After an instant of panic, I began to laugh, as if Don Juan had told me a joke. I even heard myself saying, Don Juan, you're incorrigible. Don Juan seemed to understand everything I was experiencing. He shook his head from side to side and raised his eyes to the heavens in a gesture of mock despair. I am so incorrigible, he said, that I am going to give the flyer's mind, which you carry inside you, one more jolt. I am going to reveal to you one of the most extraordinary secrets of sorcery. I am going to describe to you a finding that took sorcerers thousands of years to verify and consolidate. He looked at me and smiled maliciously. The flyer's mind flees forever, he said, when a sorcerer succeeds in grabbing on to the vibrating force that holds us together as a conglomerate of energy fields. If a sorcerer maintains that pressure long enough, the flyer's mind flees in defeat. That's exactly what you are going to do. Hold on to the energy that binds you together. I had the most inexplicable reaction I could have imagined. Something in me actually shook, as if it had received a jolt. I entered into a state of unwarranted fear, which I immediately associated with my religious background. Don Juan looked at me from head to toe. "You're fearing the wrath of God, aren't you?" he said. "Rest assured, that's not your fear. It's the Flyer's fear, because it knows that you will do exactly as I'm telling you." His words didn't calm me at all. I felt worse. I was actually convulsing involuntarily, and I had no means to stop it. "Don't worry," Don Juan said calmly. "I know for a fact that those attacks wear off very quickly. The Flyer's mind has no concentration whatsoever." After a moment, everything stopped, as Don Juan had predicted. To say again that I was bewildered is a euphemism. This was the first time ever, with Don Juan or alone in my life, that I didn't know whether I was coming or going. I wanted to get out of the chair and walk around, but I was deathly afraid. I was filled with rational assertions, and at the same time I was filled with an infantile fear. I began to breathe deeply as a cold perspiration covered my entire body. I had somehow unleashed on myself a most god-awful sight. Black, fleeting shadows jumping all around me wherever I turned. I closed my eyes and rested my head on the arm of the stuffed chair. "I don't know which way to turn, Don Juan," I said. "Tonight you've really succeeded in getting me lost." "You're being torn by an internal struggle," Don Juan said. "Down in the depths of you, you know that you are incapable of refusing the agreement that an indispensable part of you, your glowing coat of awareness, is going to serve as an incomprehensible source of nourishment to naturally incomprehensible entities. And another part of you will stand against this situation with all its might. The Sorcerer's Revolution," he continued, "is that they refuse to honor agreements in which they did not participate. Nobody ever asked me if I would consent to be eaten by beings of a different kind of awareness. My parents just brought me into this world to be food like themselves, and that's the end of the story." Don Juan stood up from his chair and stretched his arms and legs. "We've been sitting here for hours. It's time to go into the house. I'm going to eat. Do you want to eat with me?" I declined. My stomach was in an uproar. "I think you'd better go to sleep," he said. "The Blitz has devastated you." I didn't need any further coaxing. I collapsed onto my bed and fell asleep like the dead. At home, as time went by, the idea of the Flyers became one of the main fixations of my life. I got to the point where I felt that Don Juan was absolutely right about them. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't discard his logic. The more I thought about it and the more I talked to and observed myself and my fellow men, the more intense the conviction that something was rendering us incapable of any activity or any interaction or any thought that didn't have the self as its focal point. My concern, as well as the concern of everyone I knew or talked to, was the self. Since I couldn't find any explanation for such universal homogeneity, I believed that Don Juan's line of thought was the most appropriate way of elucidating the phenomenon. I went as deeply as I could into readings about myths and legends. In reading, I experienced something I had never felt before. Each of the books I read was an interpretation of myths and legends. In each one of those books, a homogeneous mind was palpable. The styles differed, but the drive behind the words was homogeneously the same. Even though the theme was something as abstract as myths and legends, the authors always managed to insert statements about themselves. The homogeneous drive behind every one of those books was not the stated theme of the book. Instead, it was self-service. I had never felt this before. I attributed my reaction to Don Juan's influence. The unavoidable question that I posed to myself was, is he influencing me to see this? Or is there really a foreign mind dictating everything we do? I lapsed, perforce, into denial again, and I went insanely from denial to acceptance to denial. Something in me knew that whatever Don Juan was driving at was an energetic fact, but something equally important in me knew that all of that was guff. The end result of my internal struggle was a sense of foreboding, the sense of something imminently dangerous coming at me. I made extensive anthropological inquiries into the subject of the flyers in other cultures, but I couldn't find any references to them anywhere. Don Juan seemed to be the only source of information about this matter. The next time I saw him, I instantly jumped to talk about the flyers. I've tried my best to be rational about this subject matter, I said. But I can't. There are moments when I fully agree with you about these predators. Focus your attention on the fleeting shadows that you actually see, Don Juan said with a smile. I told Don Juan that those fleeting shadows were going to be the end of my rational life. I saw them everywhere. Since I'd left his house, I was incapable of going to sleep in the dark. To sleep with the lights on didn't bother me at all. The moment I turned the lights off, however, everything around me began to jump. I never saw complete figures or shapes. All I saw were fleeting black shadows. The flyer's mind has not left you, Don Juan said. It has been seriously injured. It's trying its best to rearrange its relationship with you, but something in you is severed forever. The flyer knows that. The real danger is that the flyer's mind may win by getting you tired and forcing you to quit by playing the contradiction between what it says and what I say. You see, the flyer's mind has no competitors, Don Juan continued. When it proposes something, it agrees with its own proposition and makes you believe that you've done something of worth. The flyer's mind will say to you that whatever Juan Matus is telling you is pure nonsense, and then the same mind will agree with its own proposition. Yes, of course, it's nonsense, you will say. That's the way they overcome us. The flyers are an essential part of the universe, he went on, and they must be taken as what they really are. Awesome, monstrous. They are the means by which the universe tests us. We are energetic probes created by the universe, he continued, as if he were oblivious to my presence. And it's because we are possessors of energy that has awareness that we are the means by which the universe becomes aware of itself. The flyers are the implacable challengers. They cannot be taken as anything else. If we succeed in doing that, the universe allows us to continue. I wanted Don Juan to say more, but he said only, "The Blitz ended the last time you were here. There's only so much you could say about the flyers. It's time for another kind of maneuver." I couldn't sleep that night. I fell into a light sleep in the early hours of the morning, until Don Juan dragged me out of my bed and took me for a hike in the mountains. Where he lived, the configuration of the land was very different from that of the Sonoran Desert, but he told me not to indulge in comparison, that after walking for a quarter of a mile, every place in the world was just the same. Sightseeing is for people in cars, he said. They go at great speed without any effort on their part. Sightseeing is not for walkers. For instance, when you're riding in a car, you may see a gigantic mountain whose sight overwhelms you with its beauty. The sight of the same mountain will not overwhelm you in the same manner if you look at it while you're going on foot. It will overwhelm you in a different way, especially if you have to climb it or go around it. It was very hot that morning. We walked on a dry riverbed. One thing that this valley and the Sonoran Desert had in common was their millions of insects. The gnats and flies all around me were like dive bombers that aimed at my nostrils, eyes, and ears. Don Juan told me not to pay attention to their buzzing. "Don't try to disperse them with your hand," he uttered in a firm tone. "Intend them away. Set up an energy barrier around you. Be silent, and from your silence the barrier will be constructed. Nobody knows how this is done. It's one of those things that the old sorcerers called energetic facts. Shut off your internal dialogue. That's all it takes." "I want to propose a weird idea to you," Don Juan went on as he kept walking ahead of me. I had to accelerate my steps to be closer to him so as not to miss anything he said. "I have to stress that it's a weird idea that will find endless resistance in you," he said. "I will tell you beforehand that you won't accept it easily, but the fact that it's weird should not be a deterrent. You're a social scientist, therefore your mind is always open to inquiry. Isn't that so?" Don Juan was shamelessly making fun of me. I knew it, but it didn't bother me. Perhaps due to the fact that he was walking so fast and I had to make a tremendous effort to keep up with him, his sarcasm just sloughed off me, and instead of making me feisty, it made me laugh. My undivided attention was focused on what he was saying, and the insects either stopped bothering me because I had intended a barrier of energy around me, or because I was so busy listening to Don Juan that I didn't care about their buzzing around me anymore. "The weird idea," he said slowly, measuring the effect of his words, "is that every human being on this earth seems to have exactly the same reactions, the same thoughts, the same feelings. They seem to respond in more or less the same way to the same stimuli. Those reactions seem to be sort of bogged up by the language they speak, but if we scrape that off, they are exactly the same reactions that besiege every human being on earth. I would like you to become curious about this, as a social scientist, of course, and see if you could formally account for such homogeneity." Don Juan collected a series of plants. Some of them could hardly be seen. They seemed to be more in the realm of algae, moss. I held his bag open, and we didn't speak anymore. When he had enough plants, he headed back for his house, walking as fast as he could. He said that he wanted to clean and separate those plants and put them in a proper order before they dried up too much. I was deeply involved in thinking about the task he had delineated for me. I began by trying to review in my mind if I knew of any articles or papers written on this subject. I thought that I would have to research it, and I decided to begin my research by reading all the works available on national character. I got enthusiastic about the topic in a haphazard way, and I really wanted to start for home right away, for I wanted to take his task to heart. But before we reached his house, Don Juan sat down on a high ledge overlooking the valley. He didn't say anything for a while. He was not out of breath. I couldn't conceive of why he had stopped to sit down. "The task of the day for you," he said abruptly in a foreboding tone, "is one of the most mysterious things of sorcery, something that goes beyond language, beyond explanations. We went for a hike today. We talked, because the mystery of sorcery must be cushioned in the mundane. It must stem from nothing and go back again to nothing. That's the art of warrior travelers, to go through the eye of a needle unnoticed. So, brace yourself by propping your back against this rock wall as far as possible from the edge. I will be by you in case you faint or fall down." "What are you planning to do, Don Juan?" I asked, and my alarm was so patent that I noticed it and lowered my voice. I want you to cross your legs and enter into inner silence, he said. Let's say that you want to find out what articles you could look for to discredit or substantiate what I've asked you to do in your academic milieu. Enter into inner silence, but don't fall asleep. This is not a journey through the dark sea of awareness. This is seeing from inner silence. It was rather difficult for me to enter into inner silence without falling asleep. I fought a nearly invincible desire to fall asleep. I succeeded and found myself looking at the bottom of the valley from an impenetrable darkness around me. And then I saw something that chilled me to the marrow of my bones. I saw a gigantic shadow, perhaps 15 feet across, leaping in the air and then landing with a silent thud. I felt the thud in my bones, but I didn't hear it. They are really heavy, Don Juan said in my ear. He was holding me by the left arm as hard as he could. I saw something that looked like a mud shadow wriggle on the ground and then take another gigantic leap, perhaps 50 feet long, and land again with the same ominous silent thud. I fought not to lose my concentration. I was frightened beyond anything I could rationally use as a description. I kept my eyes fixed on the jumping shadow on the bottom of the valley. Then I heard a most peculiar buzzing, a mixture of the sound of flapping wings and the buzzing of a radio whose dial has not quite picked up the frequency of a radio station. And the thud that followed was something unforgettable. It shook Don Juan and me to the core. A gigantic black mud shadow had just landed by our feet. Don't be frightened, Don Juan said imperiously. Keep your inner silence and it will move away. I was shivering from head to toe. I had the clear knowledge that if I didn't keep my inner silence alive, the mud shadow would cover me up like a blanket and suffocate me. Without losing the darkness around me, I screamed at the top of my voice. Never had I been so angry, so utterly frustrated. The mud shadow took another leap, clearly to the bottom of the valley. I kept on screaming, shaking my legs. I wanted to shake off whatever might come to eat me. My state of nervousness was so intense that I lost track of time. Perhaps I fainted. When I came to my senses, I was lying in my bed in Don Juan's house. There was a towel soaked in icy cold water wrapped around my forehead. I was burning with fever. One of Don Juan's female cohorts rubbed my back, chest, and forehead with rubbing alcohol, but this did not relieve me. The heat I was experiencing came from within myself. It was wrath and impotence that generated it. Don Juan laughed, as if what was happening to me was the funniest thing in the world. Peals of laughter came out of him in an endless barrage. I would never have thought that you would take seeing a flyer so much to heart, he said. He took me by the hand and led me to the back of his house, where he dunked me in a huge tub of water, fully clothed, shoes, watch, everything. My watch, I screamed. Don Juan twisted with laughter. You shouldn't wear a watch when you come to see me, he said. Now you've fouled up your watch. I took off my watch and put it by the side of the tub. I remembered that it was waterproof and that nothing would happen to it. Being dunked in the tub helped me enormously. When Don Juan pulled me out of the freezing water, I had gained a degree of control. That sight is preposterous, I kept on repeating, unable to say anything else. The predator Don Juan had described was not something benevolent. It was enormously heavy, gross, indifferent. I felt its disregard for us. Doubtless, it had crushed us ages ago, making us, as Don Juan had said, weak, vulnerable, and docile. I took off my wet clothes, covered myself with a poncho, sat in my bed, and veritably wept my head off. But not for myself. I had my wrath, my unbending intent not to let them eat me. I wept for my fellow men, especially for my father. I never knew until that instant that I loved him so much. He never had a chance, I heard myself repeating over and over, as if the words were not really mine. My poor father, the most considerate being I knew, so tender, so gentle, so helpless. Starting on the definitive journey. The jump into the abyss. There was only one trail leading to the flat mesa. Once we were on the mesa itself, I realized that it wasn't as extensive as it had appeared when I looked at it from a distance. The vegetation on the mesa wasn't different from the vegetation below. Faded, green, woody shrubs that had the ambiguous appearance of trees. At first, I didn't see the chasm. It was only when Don Juan led me to it that I became aware that the mesa ended in a precipice. It wasn't really a mesa, but merely the flat top of a good-sized mountain. The mountain was round and eroded on its east and south faces. However, on part of its west and north sides, it seemed to have been cut with a knife. From the edge of the precipice, I was able to see the bottom of the ravine, perhaps 600 feet below. It was covered with the same woody shrubs that grew everywhere. A whole row of small mountains to the south and to the north of that mountaintop gave the clear impression that they had been part of a gigantic canyon, millions of years old, dug out by a no longer existing river. The edges of that canyon had been erased by erosion. At certain points, they'd been leveled with the ground. The only portion still intact was the area where I was standing. "It's solid rock," Don Juan said, as if he were reading my thoughts. He pointed with his chin toward the bottom of the ravine. "If anything were to fall down from this edge to the bottom, it would get smashed to flakes on the rock, down there." This was the initial dialogue between Don Juan and myself that day on that mountaintop. Prior to going there, he had told me that his time on Earth had come to an end. He was leaving on his definitive journey. His statements were devastating to me. I truly lost my grip and entered into a blissful state of fragmentation, perhaps similar to what people experience when they have a mental breakdown. But there was a core fragment of myself that remained cohesive, the me of my childhood. The rest was vagueness, incertitude. I'd been fragmented for so long that to become fragmented once again was the only way out of my devastation. A most peculiar interplay between different levels of my awareness took place afterwards. Don Juan, his cohort, Don Genaro, two of his apprentices, Pablito and Nestor, and I had climbed to that mountaintop. Pablito, Nestor, and I were there to take care of our last task as apprentices, to jump into an abyss, a most mysterious affair, which Don Juan had explained to me at various levels of awareness, but which has remained an enigma to me to this day. Don Juan jokingly said that I should get my writing pad and start taking notes about our last moments together. He gently poked me in the ribs and assured me, as he hid his laughter, that it would have been only proper since I'd started on the warrior traveler's path by taking notes. Don Genaro cut in and said that the other warrior travelers before us had stood on that same flat mountaintop before embarking on their journey to the unknown. Don Juan turned to me and in a soft voice said that soon I would be entering into infinity by the force of my personal power, and that he and Don Genaro were there only to bid me farewell. Don Genaro cut in again and said that I was there also to do the same for them. Once you have entered into infinity, Don Juan said, you can't depend on us to bring you back. Your decision is needed then. Only you can decide whether or not to return. I must also warn you that few warrior travelers survive this type of encounter with infinity. Infinity is enticing beyond belief. A warrior traveler finds that to return to the world of disorder, compulsion, noise, and pain is a most unappealing affair. You must know that your decision to stay or to return is not a matter of a reasonable choice, but a matter of intending it. If you choose not to return, he continued, you will disappear as if the earth had swallowed you. But if you choose to come back, you must tighten your belt and wait like a true warrior traveler until your task, whatever it might be, is finished, either in success or in defeat. A very subtle change began to take place in my awareness then. I started to remember faces of people, but I wasn't sure I had met them. Strange feelings of anguish and affection started to mount. Don Juan's voice was no longer audible. I longed for people I sincerely doubted I'd ever met. I was suddenly possessed by the most unbearable love for those persons, whoever they may have been. My feelings for them were beyond words, and yet I couldn't tell who they were. I only sensed their presence, as if I had lived another life before, or as if I were feeling for people in a dream. I sensed that their outside forms shifted. They began by being tall and ended up petite. What was left intact was their essence, the very thing that produced my unbearable longing for them. Don Juan came to my side and said to me, "The agreement was that you remain in the awareness of the daily world." His voice was harsh and authoritative. "Today, you are going to fulfill a concrete task," he went on, "the last link of a long chain, and you must do it in your utmost mood of reason." I had never heard Don Juan talk to me in that tone of voice. He was a different man at that instant, yet he was thoroughly familiar to me. I meekly obeyed him and went back to the awareness of the world of everyday life. I didn't know that I was doing this, however. To me, it appeared on that day as if I had acquiesced to Don Juan out of fear and respect. Don Juan spoke to me next in the tone I was accustomed to. What he said was also very familiar. He said that the backbone of a warrior traveler is humbleness and efficiency, acting without expecting anything and withstanding anything that lies ahead of him. I went at that point through another shift in my level of awareness. My mind focused on a thought or a feeling of anguish. I knew then that I had made a pact with some people to die with them, and I couldn't remember who they were. I felt without the shadow of a doubt that it was wrong that I should die alone. My anguish became unbearable. Don Juan spoke to me. "We are alone," he said. "That's our condition. But to die alone is not to die in loneliness." I took big gulps of air to erase my tension. As I breathed deeply, my mind became clear. "The great issue with us males is our frailty," he went on. "When our awareness begins to grow, it grows like a column, right on the midpoint of our luminous being, from the ground up. That column has to reach a considerable height before we can rely on it. At this time in your life, as a sorcerer, you easily lose your grip on your new awareness. When you do that, you forget everything you've done and seen on the warrior traveler's path because your consciousness shifts back to the awareness of your everyday life. I've explained to you that the task of every male sorcerer is to reclaim everything he's done and seen on the warrior traveler's path while he was on new levels of awareness. The problem of every male sorcerer is that he easily forgets, because his awareness loses its new level and falls to the ground at the drop of a hat. I understand exactly what you're saying, Don Juan, I said. Perhaps this is the first time I've come to the full realization of why I forget everything, and why I remember everything later. I've always believed that my shifts were due to a personal pathological condition. I know now why these changes take place, yet I can't verbalize what I know. Don't worry about verbalizations, Don Juan said. You'll verbalize all you want in due time. Today, you must act on your inner silence, on what you know without knowing. You know to perfection what you have to do, but this knowledge is not quite formulated in your thoughts yet. On the level of concrete thoughts or sensations, all I had were vague feelings of knowing something that wasn't part of my mind. I had then the clearest sense of having taken a huge step down. Something seemed to have dropped inside me. It was almost a jolt. I knew that I had entered into another level of awareness at that instant. Don Juan told me then that it's obligatory that a warrior traveler say goodbye to all the people he leaves behind. He must say his goodbye in a loud and clear voice so that his shout and his feelings will remain forever recorded in those mountains. I hesitated for a long time, not out of bashfulness, but because I didn't know whom to include in my thanks. I'd completely internalized the sorcerer's concept that warrior travelers can't owe anything to anyone. Don Juan had drilled a sorcerer's axiom into me. Warrior travelers pay elegantly, generously, and with unequaled ease every favor, every service rendered to them. In this manner, they get rid of the burden of being indebted. I had paid, or I was in the process of paying, everyone who had honored me with their care or concern. I had recapitulated my life to such an extent that I had not left a single stone unturned. I truthfully believed in those days that I didn't owe anything to anyone. I expressed my beliefs and hesitation to Don Juan. Don Juan said that I had indeed recapitulated my life thoroughly, but he added that I was far from being free of indebtedness. How about your ghosts? He went on. Those you can no longer touch. He knew what he was talking about. During my recapitulation, I had recounted to him every incident of my life. Out of the hundreds of incidents that I related to him, he had isolated 3 as samples of indebtedness that I incurred very early in life, and added to that my indebtedness to the person who was instrumental in my meeting him. I'd thanked my friend profusely, and I had sensations that something out there acknowledged my thanks. The other 3 had remained stories from my life, stories of people who had given me an inconceivable gift and whom I had never thanked. One of these stories had to do with a man I'd known when I was a child. His name was Mr. Leandro Acosta. He was my grandfather's arch enemy, his true nemesis. My grandfather had accused this man repeatedly of stealing chickens from his chicken farm. The man wasn't a vagrant, but someone who didn't have a steady, definite job. He was a maverick of sorts, a gambler, a master of many trades, handyman, self-styled curer, hunter, and provider of plant and insect specimens for local herbalists and curers, and any kind of bird or mammal life for taxidermists or pet shops. People believed that he made tons of money, but that he couldn't keep it or invest it. His detractors and friends alike believed that he could have established the most prosperous business in the area, doing what he knew best, searching for plants and hunting animals. But that he was cursed with a strange disease of the spirit that made him restless, incapable of tending to anything for any length of time. One day, while I was taking a stroll on the edge of my grandfather's farm, I noticed that someone was watching me from between the thick bushes at the forest's edge. It was Mr. Acosta. He was squatting inside the bushes of the jungle itself and would have been totally out of sight had it not been for my sharp 8-year-old eyes. No wonder my grandfather thinks that he comes to steal chickens, I thought. I believed that no one else but me could have noticed him. He was utterly concealed by his motionlessness. I'd caught the difference between the bushes and his silhouette by feeling rather than sight. I approached him. The fact that people rejected him so viciously or liked him so passionately intrigued me to no end. "What are you doing there, Mr. Acosta?" I asked daringly. "I'm taking a shit while I look at your grandfather's farm," he said. "So you better scram before I get up unless you like the smell of shit." I moved away a short distance. I wanted to know if he was really doing what he was claiming. He was. He got up. I thought he was going to leave the bush and come onto my grandfather's land and perhaps walk across to the road, but he didn't. He began to walk inward into the jungle. Hey, Mr. Acosta," I yelled. "Can I come with you?" I noticed that he'd stopped walking. It was again more a feeling than an actual sight because the bush was so thick. "You can certainly come with me if you can find an entry into the bush," he said. That wasn't difficult for me. In my hours of idleness, I had marked an entry into the bush with a good-sized rock. I had found out through an endless process of trial and error that there was a crawling space there, which if I followed for 3 or 4 yards, turned into an actual trail on which I could stand up and walk. Mr. Acosta came to me and said, "Bravo, kid. You've done it. Yes, come with me if you want to." That was the beginning of my association with Mr. Leandro Acosta. We went on daily hunting expeditions. Our association became so obvious since I was gone from the house from dawn to sunset without anybody ever knowing where I went, that finally my grandfather admonished me severely. "You must select your acquaintances," he said, "or you will end up being like them. I will not tolerate this man affecting you in any way imaginable. He can certainly transmit to you his elan, yes, and he could influence your mind to be just like his, useless. I'm telling you, if you don't put an end to this, I will. I'll send the authorities after him on charges of stealing my chickens, because you know damn well that he comes every day and steals them." I tried to show my grandfather the absurdity of his charges. Mr. Acosta didn't have to steal chickens. He had the vastness of that jungle at his command. He could have drawn from that jungle anything he wanted, but my arguments infuriated my grandfather even more. I realized then that my grandfather secretly envied Mr. Acosta's freedom, and Mr. Acosta was transformed for me by this realization from a nice hunter into the ultimate expression of what is at the same time both forbidden and desired. I attempted to curtail my encounters with Mr. Acosta, but the lure was just too overwhelming for me. Then one day, Mr. Acosta and 3 of his friends proposed that I do something that Mr. Acosta had never done before: catch a vulture alive, uninjured. He explained to me that the vultures of the area, which were enormous, with a 5 to 6 foot wingspan, had 7 different types of flesh in their bodies, and each one of those 7 types served a specific curative purpose. He said that the desired state was that the vulture's body not be injured. The vulture had to be killed by tranquilizer, not by violence. It was easy to shoot them, but in that case, the meat lost its curative value. So the art was to catch them alive, a thing that he had never done. He had figured out, though, that with my help and the help of his 3 friends, he had the problem licked. He assured me that his was a natural conclusion arrived at after hundreds of occasions on which he'd observed the behavior of vultures. "We need a dead donkey in order to perform this feat, something which we have," he declared ebulliently. He looked at me, waiting for me to ask the question of what would be done with the dead donkey. Since the question was not asked, he proceeded. "We remove the intestines, and we put some sticks in there to keep the roundness of the belly. The leader of the turkey vultures is the king. He's the biggest, the most intelligent," he went on. "No sharper eyes exist. That's what makes him a king. He'll be the one who will spot the dead donkey, and the first who'll land on it. He'll land downwind from the donkey to really smell that it's dead. The intestines and soft organs that we're going to draw out of the donkey's belly will pile by his rear end outside. That way, it looks like a wild cat has already eaten some of it. Then, lazily, the vulture will come over to the donkey. He'll take his time. He'll come hopping, flying, and then he'll land on the dead donkey's hip and begin to rock the donkey's body. He would turn it over if it weren't for the 4 sticks that will stake into the ground as part of the armature. He'll stand on the hip for a while. That will be the clue for other vultures to come and land there in the vicinity. Only when he has 3 or 4 of his companions down with him will the king vulture begin his work." "And what is my role in all this, Mr. Acosta?" I asked. "You hide inside the donkey," he said, with a deadpan expression. "Nothing to it. I give you a pair of specially designed leather gloves, and you sit there and wait until the king turkey vulture rips the anus of the dead donkey open with his enormous, powerful beak and sticks his head in to begin eating. Then you grab him by the neck with both hands and don't let go. My 3 friends and I will be hiding on horseback in a deep ravine. I'll be watching the operation with binoculars. When I see that you've grabbed the king vulture by the neck, we'll come at full gallop and throw ourselves on top of the vulture and subdue him." "Can you subdue that vulture, Mr. Acosta?" I asked him. Not that I doubted his skill, I just wanted to be assured. "Of course I can," he said, with all the confidence in the world. "We're all going to be wearing gloves and leather leggings. The vulture's talons are quite powerful. It could break a shin bone like a twig." There was no way out for me. I was caught, nailed by an exorbitant excitation. My admiration for Mr. Leandro Acosta knew no limits at that moment. I saw him as a true hunter, resourceful, cunning, knowledgeable. "Okay, let's do it then," I said. "That's my boy," said Mr. Acosta. "I expected as much from you." He had put a thick blanket behind his saddle, and one of his friends just lifted me up and put me on Mr. Acosta's horse, right behind the saddle, sitting on the blanket. "Hold on to the saddle," Mr. Acosta said. "And as you hold on to the saddle, hold the blanket, too." We took off at a leisurely trot. We rode for perhaps an hour until we came to some flat, dry, desolate lands. We stopped by a tent that resembled a vendor's stand in a market. It had a flat roof for shade. Underneath that roof was a dead brown donkey. It didn't seem that old. It looked like an adolescent donkey. Neither Mr. Acosta nor his friends explained to me whether they had found or killed the dead donkey. I waited for them to tell me, but I wasn't going to ask. While they made the preparations, Mr. Acosta explained that the tent was in place because vultures were on the lookout from huge distances out there, circling very high out of sight, but certainly capable of seeing everything that was going on. "Those creatures are creatures of sight alone," Mr. Acosta said. "They have miserable ears, and their noses are not as good as their eyes. We have to plug every hole of the carcass. I don't want you to be peeking out of any hole, because they'll see your eye and never come down. They must see nothing." They put some sticks inside the donkey's belly and crossed them, leaving enough room for me to crawl in. At one moment, I finally ventured the question that I was dying to ask. "Tell me, Mr. Acosta, this donkey surely died of illness, didn't he? Do you think its disease could affect me?" Mr. Acosta raised his eyes to the sky. "Come on! You cannot be that dumb. Donkey's diseases cannot be transmitted to man. Let's live this adventure and not worry about stupid details. If I were shorter, I'd be inside that donkey's belly myself. Do you know what it is to catch the king of turkey buzzards?" I believed him. His words were sufficient to set up a cloak of unequaled confidence over me. I wasn't going to get sick and miss the event of events. The dreaded moment came when Mr. Acosta put me inside the donkey. Then they stretched the skin over the armature and began to sew it closed. They left, nevertheless, a large area open at the bottom against the ground for air to circulate in. The horrendous moment for me came when the skin was finally closed over my head like the lid of a coffin. I breathed hard, thinking only about the excitement of grabbing the king of vultures by the neck. Mr. Acosta gave me last-minute instructions. He said that he would let me know by a whistle that resembled a bird call when the king vulture was flying around and when it had landed, so as to keep me informed and prevent me from fretting or getting impatient. Then I heard them pulling down the tent, followed by their horses galloping away. It was a good thing that they hadn't left a single space open to look out from, because that's what I would have done. The temptation to look up and see what was going on was nearly irresistible. A long time went by in which I didn't think of anything. Then I heard Mr. Acosta's whistling, and I presumed the king vulture was circling around. My presumption turned to certainty when I heard the flapping of powerful wings, and then suddenly the dead donkey's body began to rock as if it were in a windstorm. Then I felt a weight on the donkey's body, and I knew that the king vulture had landed on the donkey and wasn't moving anymore. I heard the flapping of other wings and the whistling of Mr. Acosta in the distance. Then I braced myself for the inevitable. The body of the donkey began to shake as something started to rip the skin. Then, suddenly, a huge, ugly head with a red crest, an enormous beak, and a piercing open eye burst in. I yelled with fright and grabbed the neck with both hands. I think I stunned the king vulture for an instant because he didn't do anything, which gave me the opportunity to grab his neck even harder. And then all hell broke loose. He ceased to be stunned and began to pull with such force that I was smashed against the structure, and in the next instant I was partially out of the donkey's body, armature and all, holding on to the neck of the invading beast for dear life. I heard Mr. Acosta's galloping horse in the distance. I heard him yelling, "Let go, boy, let go! He's going to fly away with you!" The king vulture indeed was going to either fly away with me, holding onto his neck, or rip me apart with the force of his talons. The reason he couldn't reach me was because his head was sunk halfway into the viscera and the armature. His talons kept slipping on the loose intestines, and they never actually touched me. Another thing that saved me was that the force of the vulture was involved in pulling his neck out from my clasp, and he couldn't move his talons far forward enough to really injure me. The next thing I knew, Mr. Acosta had landed on top of the vulture at the precise moment that my leather gloves came off my hands. Mr. Acosta was beside himself with joy. "We've done it, boy, we've done it," he said. "The next time, we will have longer stakes on the ground that the vulture cannot yank out, and you will be strapped to the structure." My relationship with Mr. Acosta had lasted long enough for us to catch a vulture. Then my interest in following him disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared, and I never really had the opportunity to thank him for all the things that he had taught me. Don Juan said that he had taught me the patience of a hunter at the best time to learn it, and above all, he had taught me to draw from solitariness all the comfort that a hunter needs. You cannot confuse solitude with solitariness, Don Juan explained to me once. Solitude for me is psychological, of the mind. Solitariness is physical. One is debilitating, the other comforting. For all this, Don Juan had said, I was indebted to Mr. Acosta forever, whether or not I understood indebtedness the way warrior travelers understand it. The second person Don Juan thought I was indebted to was a 10-year-old child I'd known growing up. His name was Armando Velez. Just like his name, he was extremely dignified, starchy, a little old man. I liked him very much because he was firm and yet very friendly. He was someone who could not easily be intimidated. He would fight anyone if he needed to, and yet he wasn't a bully at all. The two of us used to go on fishing expeditions. We used to catch very small fish that lived under rocks and had to be gathered by hand. We would put the tiny fish we caught to dry in the sun and eat them raw, all day sometimes. I also liked the fact that he was very resourceful and clever, as well as being ambidextrous. He could throw a rock with his left hand farther than with his right. We had endless competitive games in which, to my ultimate chagrin, he always won. He used to sort of apologize to me for winning by saying, "If I slow down and let you win, you'll hate me. It'll be an affront to your manhood, so try harder." Because of his excessively starchy behavior, we used to call him Señor Velez, but the Señor was shortened to Sho, a custom typical of the region in South America where I come from. One day, Sho Velez asked me something quite unusual. He began his request naturally as a challenge to me. "I bet anything," he said, "that I know something that you wouldn't dare do." "What are you talking about, Sho Velez?" "You wouldn't dare go down a river in a raft." "Oh, yes, I would. I've done it in a flooded river. I got stranded on an island for 8 days once. They had to drift food to me." This was the truth. My other best friend was a child nicknamed Crazy Shepherd. We got stranded in a flood on an island once, with no way for anyone to rescue us. Townspeople expected the flood to overrun the island and kill us both. They drifted baskets of food down the river in the hope that they would land on the island, which they did. They kept us alive in this fashion until the water had subsided enough for them to reach us with a raft and pull us to the banks of the river. "No, this is a different affair," Sho Velez continued with his erudite attitude. "This one implies going on a raft on a subterranean river." He pointed out that a huge section of a local river went through a mountain. That subterranean section of the river had always been a most intriguing place for me. Its entrance into the mountain was a foreboding cave of considerable size, always filled with bats and smelling of ammonia. Children of the area were told that it was the entrance to hell. Sulfur fumes, heat, stench. "You bet your friggin' boots, Sho Velez, that I'll never go near that river in my lifetime," I said, yelling. "Not in 10 lifetimes. You have to be really crazy to do something like that." Sho Velez's serious face got even more solemn. "Oh," he said, "then I'll have to go do it all by myself." I thought for a minute that I could goad you into going with me. I was wrong. My loss. "Hey, Sho Velez, what's with you? Why in the world would you go into that hellish place?" "I have to," he said in his gruff little voice. "You see, my father is as crazy as you are, except that he is a father and a husband. He has 6 people who depend on him. Otherwise, he would be as crazy as a goat. My 2 sisters, my 2 brothers, my mother, and I depend on him. He's everything to us." I didn't know who Sho Velez's father was. I'd never seen him. I didn't know what he did for a living. Sho Velez revealed that his father was a businessman and that everything that he owned was on the line, so to speak. My father has constructed a raft and wants to go. He wants to make that expedition. My mother said that he's just letting off steam, but I don't trust him. Chauvelez continued. I've seen your crazy look in his eyes. One of these days, he'll do it, and I'm sure that he'll die. So I'm going to take his raft and go into that river myself. I know that I will die, but my father won't. I felt something like an electric shock go through my neck, and I heard myself saying in the most agitated tone one can imagine,